For reasons definitely unrelated to recently proposed $5 billion projects in the US state of Arizona, I have spent much of the last week reading papers and analyses and reports on the practicalities and impracticalities, there's a lot more of those, of seawater desalination plants. And since there's no way to salvage any kind of audience from that snooze of an intro, I'll get right into it. The most common type of seawater desalination plant, they account for about 70% of the ones on Earth, are reverse osmosis plants. This is essentially, you take your seawater, you strain it through an extremely fine mesh net, and what you get is your potable drinking water. Now these are, thankfully, also the most efficient kind of desalination plant on Earth, but even they only get 40% of their input water back as potable output water. The remaining 60% becomes a brine. And even though, yes, technically, the amount of salt that enters the plant is the same as the amount of salt that exits the plant, the concentration of the salt in the brine is a problem in of itself. Essentially, within any volume, technically not volume, some amount of water, there's a finite amount of other material that can be dissolved in that water. And more salt dissolved in that water means less oxygen dissolved in that water. And even in the case of these desalination plants, remember, the most efficient kind we have, the brine is concentrated enough that there is not enough oxygen in the output water for fish to be able to breathe in it. And since they can't breathe, they die. And the other problem is that this brine is denser than water is. So wherever it's discharged, it sinks to the sea floor and just stays there and builds up, and actually in most cases gets more concentrated. This means it creates a kill zone where basically nothing can breathe, and then the decaying bodies of everything that's died in its vicinity contributes to the salt content, and the decaying bodies takes even more oxygen out of the water, creating essentially an invirtuous cycle. And then most of the rest of the desalination plants on Earth are even worse. The vast majority of the remaining are thermal desalination plants. These are basically, you take your input water, you heat it up, the evaporated water is your potable drinking water, and the rest is your waste. These are only about half as efficient as reverse osmosis plants, which does technically mean that the brine is less concentrated, but you end up needing so much to produce so much more of it that it balances itself out in the wrong direction. And these have the additional problem that they are heating up the water. And so the water that they're discharging back into the ocean is extremely warm. And sea life tends not to do very well in warm temperatures, which just adds an additional layer to the problem. And then for both of these types of plants, you have the problem that there's cleaning chemicals, and they usually have some amount of heavy metals involved in their construction, which means they're giving heavy metal poisoning to anything in the vicinity. And then there's the unfortunate fact that the place that needs seawater desalination plants the most, the Middle East, well, has had to build them primarily on the coast of the Persian Gulf, a already very hot, very salty body of water. And since the Middle East has tons of oil, they've mostly built thermal desalination plants, the ones that release hot, salty water. So they're releasing hot, salty water into an already hot and salty sea, just making the whole thing more so. And since the Persian Gulf is so shallow, it doesn't really have any ocean currents, so the huge pools of hot salty brine that form aren't being disrupted at all. And since they're just sitting there piling up, the plants are then pulling in their own wastewater, which they're having a harder and harder time actually getting any useful potable drinking water from. So they've been getting less efficient over time, while just continuing to spill out more and more brine. That's supposed to be a rhyme.